In the intake records of New York's orphan train system, there is a word that appears with unsettling frequency. Found. Not orphaned.
Not surrendered. Found. As in, encountered without prior documentation, without a paper trail, without a traceable origin. And the rate of these undocumented children doesn't map onto the geography of industrial poverty. Some of them came from somewhere the system had no record of, and the processing documents were designed to create a beginning, not to ask about what came before it. I want to begin with a document type. Not a specific document, a type. The processing record produced by the Children's Aid Society of New York in the period between 1854 and approximately 1920, the orphan train era. These records are, in the cases where they survive, meticulous. They document the child's name, estimated age, physical description, state of health at processing, receiving family name, placement location. What they do not document, in the majority of cases, is provenance, origin, where the child came from before they arrived in the society's care. The processing record begins at the moment of intake. The history before intake is, in most cases, a blank, a note, sometimes, of uncertain parentage or of unknown origin, a reference to having been found. A word that appears in these records with the calm frequency of a routine designation, found, as if children being found was a common enough occurrence to require only this single word, and no further explanation. Found. Not orphaned, not surrendered, found. As in, encountered in a specific place under specific circumstances. As in present, without prior documentation. Without a paper trail connecting the child to any prior institutional or family context, as in arriving from a social context that the receiving system either could not document or had decided not to document. The word is used in these records where I would expect to see, in a system as meticulous about the information it did record, some account of the circumstances of finding. The street where the child was encountered. The person who brought them in. The institutional context, if any, that preceded the intake. This information is absent, with a consistency that exceeds random administrative oversight. The children were found, and that is where their documented lives begin. I became interested in this investigation not through the orphan trains themselves, which have their own substantial historical literature, but through a different thread. I was looking at the rate of foundling intake in New York City institutions in the decades between 1850 and 1890. Not the absolute numbers, which fluctuate with economic conditions and immigration patterns as you would expect. The origin documentation. The rate at which intake records describe children as of unknown or undocumented origin, as opposed to children who arrived with a documented parental or institutional history that can be traced backward through the existing records. The rate of undocumented origin is higher than you would expect from a city receiving large numbers of documented immigrants and whose records of those immigrants' children, where the children are traced through family records, show a high degree of continuity. The immigrant community records their children. The parish records, the community association records, the ethnic press, all provide a dense documentary environment in which immigrant children are tracked and their identities are anchored to family structures that persist through the records. The children who arrive at intake facilities as found, as children of unknown origin, are not in this documentary environment. They come from outside it. They arrive without the social context that would connect them to any prior record, and the processing system receives them and creates their first document and moves on. Where did they come from? The official historical narrative, has a coherent answer. The industrial cities of the late 19th century generated poverty and social disruption on a scale that produced large numbers of abandoned and orphaned children. Economic migrants arrived without the support systems that would provide for dependent children. The urban poor lived in conditions that produced child mortality and family dissolution. The foundling populations of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston reflect these conditions, and the orphan train system was a response to the scale of the problem. Rational. Documented. The kind of historical narrative that closes questions. Except for the geography. The distribution of the foundlings, the pattern of where the children described as of unknown origin were being found, doesn't map cleanly onto the geography of industrial poverty and immigrant concentration. Some of the finding locations, the places recorded in the minority of intake documents that do note a geographical origin, are not the expected neighborhoods. Not the Lower East Side, not the 5 Points, not the documented zones of immigrant poverty. Some of the finding locations are outlying areas, transit points, places that would be consistent with people arriving from somewhere else, rather than with children generated by the local conditions of urban industrial poverty. And the physical descriptions in the intake records are, in a small but statistically significant minority of cases, inconsistent with the ethnic and national origins that the processing system assigned to the children. I am drawing here on the detailed work of researchers who have gone through these records systematically, comparing the physical descriptions at intake with the origins assigned at processing. The inconsistencies are not random. They cluster in specific periods. They are more common in specific types of institutions, and they are most common in the period between approximately 1860 and 1885, the period that researchers in this area have identified as the most intensive phase of the population movement they associate with the aftermath of what they call the Tartarian reset. The population movement hypothesis is this. Whatever happened to the civilization that the maps labeled as Tartaria, whether it was a catastrophic event, a gradual dissolution, a military conquest, or something we don't have a name for, produced a displaced population. People whose previous social structure had collapsed, whose documentary identity had been lost or destroyed, along with whatever institutions had maintained it, who were moving in large numbers without papers, without names the receiving systems could process, without the institutional anchors that produce a paper trail. And this displaced population, arriving at the edges of the new administrative order, was processed, given identities, assigned to categories the new system could manage, made legible to a bureaucracy that required legibility and did not inquire too carefully into the circumstances that preceded it. The orphan train system received some of them, the immigrant processing stations received others. The newly established Western settlement programs, with their promises of land and identity to people willing to move to the frontier, received still others. Each of these systems processed people from the outside of the documentary record into the inside of it. Each produced a founding document, a processing record, a first paper that began a new trail without acknowledging the trail that should have preceded it. And the people processed through these systems became, in a generation, the ancestors of Americans and Canadians and Australians, whose family histories begin at a processing document and have no verified continuity before it. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that all undocumented foundlings or unverifiable immigrant genealogies are evidence of Tartarian displacement. The historical narrative of poverty, displacement, and documentation loss in the 19th century is real
and accounts for an enormous proportion of the cases.
What I am claiming is that the proportion of unexplained, unverifiable, documentarily discontinuous origin cases in this period is higher than the historical narrative fully accounts for. That the pattern of their geographical distribution and their physical characteristics and their concentration in specific decades is specific enough to suggest something beyond general social disruption, and that the administrative systems that process them seemed, in the minority of cases where administrative correspondence survives, aware that they were dealing with a category of intake that required specific treatment. The correspondence that survives, the letters between the administrators of intake institutions and the government and charitable bodies that funded them, occasionally references with a studied casualness that I find revealing what it calls the unusual cases, not the orphans of documented poverty, not the children of traceable immigrant families who had experienced misfortune, the unusual cases handled at specific times by specific procedures, processed with a thoroughness of identity assignment that the ordinary cases don't receive, as if the administrators understood that these particular individuals had no previous identity to verify against, and that the identity being assigned was, for all practical purposes, their first. As if the administrators knew that found was not just a convenient administrative designation, but an accurate description of the situation people encountered without a prior documented existence, arriving from a social context the new system had no record of. Those people are in our family trees now. Their descendants are in every country in the industrialized world, and the paper trail that was supposed to anchor them to a history begins at a processing document in a 19th century institution and goes no further back. Because there is nothing further back. Not because they had no history, because the history they had is in the archives that burned, in the maps that stopped showing the territory they came from, in the institutional memory of a civilization that the new system was not interested in documenting. We are, many of us, the descendants of a reset, the grandchildren of processing documents that were someone's first official record of existence, and the question of who we were before that first document, of what civilization produced the people who arrived at those intake institutions without papers and without a prior trail, is the question that the processing records were designed to close rather than open. Found. That single word, that routine designation, covering something that was never routine and was never fully explained and has never, in the century and a half since the records were created, been seriously asked about by the institutions that created them. If a displaced population was moving through the inheritance period without papers, and the administrative systems of that era were specifically structured to absorb them without asking where they came from, whose descendants are walking around today with family trees that end at a founding document and go nowhere further back? Drop your thoughts below and share this if you've ever hit a wall in your own genealogy research.